Hello and welcome to the Damm Podcast, Season 2. Today we have a great episode for you guys. But first, let me introduce my co-host, Cedric Manlioners.
Thank you
might
once again
recognize
for
him
having
once
me.
again as the man who's lost most trivia games in the space of 2 episodes.
Yeah, I know. I wish this was my redemption time, but we're not gonna put a talk show in this one.
But today we're joined by a wonderful guest, Paul Lamar. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
So, first of all, how did you find the snow?
I really enjoyed the snow. I walked over here, as we talked about before the show, and I really enjoyed the first part of the walk. The last kilometer was a little bit rough.
The wind picked up, I imagine.
I think that was part of it. Also, you start getting to where the snow had been plowed, so you get those drifts.
Oh no!
Slippery.
That is there.
Yeah,
You're originally from the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Where exactly in the United States?
That is a good question. I never know really how to answer that. So let me go through the list real quickly. Virginia, Texas, Oklahoma, Texas, New York City, Dallas, Texas. The first couple of times was Houston, Texas.
Mm-hmm.
I left Nebraska in there. There was a 2-year stay in Nebraska somewhere in there. And then most recently out in Portland, Oregon, on the West Coast.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the part of America, out of all of those, I think I liked living there the most.
I mean, then you must not be too new to snow with Nebraska under the belt.
Yes.
Right, it seems like Nebraska is always snowy white in the movies.
At least once a year. They'll get a good 3 or 4 feet of snow at least once every winter.
Also in New York City, is the same.
I was in Manhattan, not too far from the UN. When you're in that part of the Manhattan, the snow doesn't really settle on the ground very often. You'll get snow outside of New York and some of the other boroughs, but you've got the subway and all the steam tunnels, and usually the snow will just fall and melt. Yeah.
Wow. I mean, I went there as a child, and I remember I have this vivid memory of just the snowy, the Fifth Avenue. Or was it the Fifth Avenue? You see, I went as a child, I clearly don't remember, but I have this, this memory of the snowy white streets and like the Big Apple and all that. And
if you can be there during a snowstorm when the snow is on the ground, it is the best time. Now, granted, everything shuts down, but that's almost the only time you can walk along the streets of New York, and it'll be quiet and peaceful. Mm-hmm. There's not hardly any traffic because the snow plows haven't come out yet, and you can just enjoy the buildings and the parks. It doesn't happen every winter though. But when it does happen, it's worth being.
I mean, in Christmas movies every year.
Yeah.
Snowing in New York City. Every year. Those stock movies, what are they called? There's like the specific...
Miracle on 34th Street, and yeah.
There's a whole segment of movies in the US just about like Christmas and they're all the same. If you put them in comparisons, they all look identical.
Yeah.
It's about which one you get to first, essentially.
Yeah.
But to get to the actual meat of the episode, could you briefly introduce yourself to the audience?
Yeah. So my background is a little bit crazy. Most of my time spent growing up was from first grade until graduating high school. My parents had moved into a house in a place called Enid, Oklahoma. And we were the biggest town within about 100 miles in any direction. And the population of Enid fluctuated while I was there between about 35,000 and 50,000 people, depending on the price of oil. Oklahoma was going through a big oil boom this would have been back in the 80s. And when the oil price was good and there was a lot of drilling going on, we could get a good population would get up to 50,000, then oil prices would change and people would move away and the population would drop. So I come from that rural American culture. My parents were considered liberals in Enid, Oklahoma, because my mom campaigned for the Equal Rights Amendment back in the 1970s and 1980s. But looking back on it now, I have to concede that liberal in rural America, even back then, is not liberal in the traditional sense of the word. And just recently, since about 2008, 2012, somewhere in there, I've started educating myself a little bit more about politics and the true history of America. I'm still in the process of learning because they don't really teach the truth about what America, the country, has done. And an American, I think, has to go out and you can learn it in college if you go and major in history.
Mm-hmm.
But if you don't major in history and you're just taking introduction to history courses, there's still large problems with. It's a big problem in America, the fact that Americans themselves don't know their own history.
I mean, would you say that politics should be implemented in the education system?
I think to have a democracy, you have to have a strong public education system. Everyone has to have a certain amount of skills taught to them. There has to be I'm going to use literacy in a very broad term to include history. There has to be a certain amount of philosophy. I know that sounds crazy, but
No.
I think there are some philosophy is sort of the thinking about thinking, and you do have to have at least the basics of thinking about thinking. Then there's math, of course, but not just the math of numbers. Mathematics is really the science of problem solving. It's sort of the science of abstraction, and I don't think in a modern age it's so important to learn how to calculate the sine of an angle, but it's important to know what the concept, why the sine of an angle is important. And I think it would help if we got people realizing that I was a math major for my first year at Rice because I really loved math.
Wow.
The math majors had a joke at Rice when I was there, and it was, if you're still using numbers, you're not doing math. Because
the symbols.
Right, it's not until you get away from numbers and you start thinking about there's so many other abstractions that are included with math. And I'm not saying everyone needs to know these, but everybody should be introduced to them. Programming, a lot of technical skills, network routing, programming, etc., actually have mathematical roots. And so you don't have to understand everything about those roots, but I think it's important to let people know that those roots are there so that they can decide for themselves if they want to learn more about it.
I mean, for example, with programming, like I chose to partake in this course, which was Programming Basics Club, which was essentially like this 2-3 year course in which you would begin with Text Wrangler, and then you would work your way up to Python and so on. But because I liked math, or because I had a basic understanding of math, the symbols that we implemented whilst programming kind of came natural, almost in a way. So in a sense, this relates back to the point that through educating myself with math, it like I made my life a lot easier when I started programming. Yes. So I think the more you educate yourself, the more you know you don't know, right? But you know at least somewhat of the general basic. I mean, we never had to do political studies or any sort of programming was ever enforced, but I mean, would you ever have taken it on your own?
I mean, I used to take IT when I was younger, but then I decided to drop that. Which honestly, for the course that we are doing now, media studies, I actually highly regret. Because we're introduced to SPSS and all types of statistical analysis. And if I took, for example, IT or the math studies, those like subjects, they were kind of aimed to help the person get introduced to the statistical analysis content. Because right now that I missed out on that part, having to do SPSS when I went to uni, it was completely new for me. And then there were some people like that, who already were introduced to it and they were able to just go through that smoothly rather than me. So I had to learn everything again.
And I don't want to leave the wrong impression. These are all, you're right, it would have been better to learn SPSS, right? But it's not for everybody. Everybody has to find their own path. I was a math major my first year at Rice, in part because I grew up in a small town in Oklahoma. I had taken all the math classes they offered, all the advanced science classes, because it's a small high school, right? And I thought I'd scored well on my SAT tests, right? So my college admission test. So I thought that I'll just major in math. I'm obviously really good at it. I was a year behind all my other freshman peers because in the city schools, in the Houstons and the Dallases, and even places like Huntsville, Texas, or Huntsville, Alabama, where they have a lot of NASA engineers working on the space shuttle. These kids had already taken their first year college math classes in high school. And they were starting with sophomore classes. And I was struggling just to catch up. So, and to the point you're talking about, I ended up switching out of mathematics because I love math. I have been learning math even after I graduated. I do love the subject, but I cannot force myself to work on it until I understand, until it has a relevance, right? I have to choose the order in which I study. Otherwise, it's just labor. It's just work.
Yeah.
And I ended up switching over to economics because I'd already had the advanced math, and all the rest of the economics classes were relatively easy.
Yeah, okay. Comparisons to it does seem that way. The thing is, it's like, I believe as well that people can change their paths and find interests, and if people have interests, they are, in my opinion, vastly more likely to succeed in their field. Because if you have a personal interest, you're not only doing it because you get money, you're doing it because you get money, but that's a byproduct. You're doing it because you got to do it for your own,
The original idea of a university, even from ancient Greece, right, wasn't to get a piece of paper saying I went to university. It was just people would show up at the square and ask, the philosophers questions, and then they would answer the questions or give lectures because they wanted to transfer the knowledge. It was all about the curiosity of it. But when you turn that into a curriculum with a goal of we have to cover these topics in this semester and these topics in this semester, it takes a lot of the fun out of it. And I totally understand why I think it's important to introduce everyone to this wide range of knowledge. But I totally understand that everybody is going to choose their own path. And I think they should. I think you need to learn, like you said, according to your interests, because it should always be fun. There should always be at least some. It's going to be work. It's going to be hard, but there should be some fun to it as well.
Because how you said you were into math when you were young as well. So do you think that if you were exposed to the same educational material as the sophomores in your year when you took math the first year, would you have, because you enjoy it, so would you be able to keep up with the content
or maybe exceed?
Yeah, or exceed
or excel.
So I can't really answer that question without giving a small history of the kinds of math I'm interested in. The thing that got me really excited about math was thinking about infinity. When I first learned that there's not just one infinity, but there's an infinite number of infinities, and that some of them have different sizes and some of them are the same size. What is a number, right? What does it mean to be a number? What is the imaginary I number? So for me, it's more about the fundamentals and about the philosophy of mathematics. If I had the same education that they had in Dallas and Houston and the big cities, I do worry that I might have become disillusioned with math because it would have been a lot more work and it would have been a lot more mechanical. And they don't really go into the philosophy behind mathematics. It's more about just
Is that quite a niche kind of industry, like the philosophy of math?
Philosophy of anything.
Yeah, that's true.
Industry might be the wrong word.
Yeah. What's the right word?
Study program?
Yeah.
Organization? It's not an organization, but it's like not a cult.
Just a program, a program.
But that's what drove me. But maybe not. Maybe I would have continued on and become a mathematics major. I do not have what it takes to be a professional mathematician. If you read Terence Tao's blog, who's in the news lately because of his work on the twin prime conjecture, but he was also a Fields Medal winner and quite famous before his work on the twin prime conjecture. He and other professional mathematicians, you'll read what they do, and they literally think about these very abstract problems every day, most of the day, just taking enough time away from it just to keep sane. I do have other interests. I'm not willing to. It's kind of like to be a professional football player.
He's a rugby player, so that one, an American football player? No, he's a rugby player.
But a professional athlete of any kind. You can love the sport, but that's different than than having the dedication to become a professional at that sport, because you have to give up everything else.
I mean, the thing is, this relates perfectly to other fields of studies, because we recently interviewed a student of political science student. He's studying political science or international political science, and he's really passionate about what he does, and he has a mission, to understand all of it. The problem is, we were having a conversation about the United States political spectrum and how he sees it as an external, participant. As the political spectrum, anyone can participate, even people from outside in this moment in time. But it was interesting because he's getting taught these things about the U.S., but he's never been there.
Yeah.
And to my idea, I guess, I would never be a politician, or at least study a country without being there, because politics should represent the people of the nation. So you can critique it from the outside, but to have a strongly opinionated piece about other people's.
I see your point, and I kind of agree. But on the other hand, sometimes to get a true picture of something, you have to be on the outside of it looking in. There's a lot of problems with police and the police culture in the U.S. right now. If you want to figure out how to improve it, you don't ask policemen. You ask people outside the police who study law enforcement across multiple countries, academics, right? Mm-hmm. It's tempting to think, and there's a lot of people in the U.S. who do think this way. I know a lot of policemen, and they say we need more, stricter laws and more, it's the same thing with medicine. Doctors don't necessarily know what the best social policies are. Individual doctors. Mm-hmm. You have to remember that very few doctors do both research and practice medicine. And if all you do is practice medicine, you're sort of like an engineer. You're not like a scientist. You lose the evidence-based way of looking at things. You're perfectly fine practicing medicine. It's a difficult profession, and it takes a lot of training and knowledge. I'm not trying to discount what they do, but just like you don't ask a policeman how to improve policing policy, you can't ask just any doctor or just any group of doctors about what the best way to improve the national healthcare system. You kind of have to step out in both cases. And it may be the same way in America. America has, for politics, imagine just taking a group of random Soviet Union residents back in the day of the Soviet Union and asking them to describe the politics of their country. And they would give a very different picture of what was happening. And it would not be very accurate because, information was not freely available. And it's kind of that way right now in the U.S. It has been since Fox News became big. And it's only gotten worse every year. So a lot of the people in the U.S. just don't have the knowledge to have a good analysis of the political situation there.
But the biggest problem that I have with that is that, I'm one of those people. I have a hot take on this, but I want to see what both of you think about it. My hot take would be that maybe not everyone should be voting. Maybe the people who care about it should be voting. Now, you should be allowed to vote. There should be an equal, the ability to vote, equal representation of the stuff. But what about those people who don't care at all and they're willing to go and vote and just take some boxes and they don't even know who they're voting for? Aren't they altering the vote of the people? And if so, and what about the people who are just not educated or have been indoctrinated by specific parties? They're not even representing themselves anymore.
It's a good question. And the solution to it seems like it would be, for instance, there's some people who think that you should have to pass a test before you're allowed to vote, right?
It's pretty weird. It sounds strange.
The problem is there's no practical way to enforce such a policy like that can't be abused over time by the people in power, because it's the people in power who get to decide what that test is, what the correct answers are. And although you might put it forward with all the best intentions, it becomes a game at that point that can be manipulated. I think it's important in a democracy that every person in the nation, or every person who's affected by the policies of that nation, should have an opportunity to vote. I had a discussion with a friend of mine from Canada, who they were saying they now have U.S. citizenship, but at the time they were expatriated to the U.S., working in the U.S., but still had Canadian citizenship. And I said, "Are you going to vote?" He goes, "No, I can't vote. I'm outside the country." And I go, "But what Canada does still impacts you. You should still have a voice." In America, most states don't let convicted felons vote.
That's terrible.
Agreed. How in the world do you get prison reform if the people most impacted by those policies aren't allowed to vote? But what you describe is a real problem. I mean, if you can, in this modern digital age of media, you can manipulate large groups of people.
Mark Zuckerberg proved it quite clearly.
Exactly. And if they can treat the population, the voting population, and just treat some percentage of it almost like trained animals, what's that mean for you? That's also not truly a democracy. But I don't think the solution is ever to restrict the vote. I think the solution might need to come in some other form. Better education, or...
Because at this point, I feel like it is very difficult for them to come out of this. Because at the end of the day, it's both political parties trying to influence the population in order to vote for them. So, I mean...
And if you don't, you lose.
Yeah, exactly. So at one point,
That's
they'll
what it
do a
feels
lot
like.
in order to...
But think about it from this perspective. And I'm not saying that you can think of American politics in terms of political parties.
Yeah.
But you can also, and this is true of many things, you can think about any phenomena from different perspectives. And it's not that one perspective is right and the other is wrong, but you sometimes find insights thinking of it one way that you wouldn't see if you just think about it in terms of, for instance, political parties. Think about what's happening in America in terms of corporate interests, the plutarchs, the rich billionaires, and the working class. And a lot of things that don't seem to make sense when you think in terms of Democrats and Republicans suddenly make sense when you think in terms of class warfare type terms. There really is not. I would love to see a communist party in the U.S. I am not communist. I probably wouldn't vote for communist candidates. But without that party being there, without that influence being taken seriously and participating in the conversations, you've seen we don't really have a left at all. The Democratic Party is not liberal.
That's one thing that was also mentioned in a previous political podcast we did. So that it's like his opinion was that the left party in the U.S. is the right-wing party in the Netherlands.
Yes.
Do you agree with that?
Yes, I think somewhat. The political system in America is set up to just cannot have more than two parties. Every time we've tried in the past, there's been times in America's history where there's been three parties or four parties. Very quickly, it just falls down to two. So the only choice the left has at this point is trying to take over one of the parties. The Democratic Party is the one they're attempting to do. And I'm hopeful that they'll have some success. I don't know that it will happen quickly enough to save the country. I think there is a real danger, more so than we've seen in 100 years, of what's happening what happened to the Soviet Union. I think could very well happen to America within the next 10 to 20 years. Now, that's just my personal opinion. A lot of people think I'm crazy, that America would never split up, but
only time will tell.
Right. I keep thinking, the West Coast is, I can totally see them becoming sort of a Taiwan.
Wow. I mean, there is an interesting question I had about it as well. Besides the fact that Marx, when you said the class struggle, I was thinking about Marx, and I never thought about class struggle in the U.S. So it's kind of strange to think about it as well. Because, there was this, I guess they were antagonizing the idea of communism so much that most people, I bet you would ask them, oh, what do you think about communists? They probably suck. They don't even know what they are.
Right.
And I think that's an important thing. Is like maybe education can lead to the general public having a broader picture of many political ideas, not simply Democrats, not simply the ones that are on TV, as you said, but the ones that maybe could work. The other friend was mentioning that socialism is the way to go in the U.S. I don't know. As a European, I don't know, but I can see on TV and I see people debate, and then I'm like, okay, it sounds good.
I would vote for a socialist candidate in the U.S. today, not because I want a socialist government in the U.S., but because the balance is so far out of whack that I feel like, having 4 to 8 to 12 years of a socialist influence to rebuild the government, to make the government something that the people could rely on to perform certain minimal functions, I think that's a good thing. And then I might, after those 4 or 8 years, go back to voting for cap. I'm not completely anti-capitalist. Maybe I should be. I don't know. But yeah, I tend to agree with your friend. Right now, the U.S. has got to think socialistically. Is that a word?
Yeah, I think that's actually yes. Yeah, it is. It is.
To both redeem the reputation of socialism in the American people's mind, and also to redeem the reputation of government. A large portion of Americans think that government is a dirty word.
Yeah, that's strange because they are being represented by that government.
Working in energy trading, I don't know if we've talked about it since, but before the podcast, most of my career, I started my career in 1989, 1990 at a consulting company called Business Systems Group, and they became BSG. And the first project I really enjoyed was working for an energy trading company. And that was early on, 90, 91, 92. It was not Enron. It could have been Enron. Enron was one of the clients that this company had. Wow. But I really loved the math involved with trading options and such. And since then, my career has mostly been focused on energy trading and risk management. And I have been working on trading floors and energy companies. And let me tell you, these are well-educated people who are also quiet right-wing. Very wow. I mean, if you think about it, if you're a company that sells natural gas, buys electricity, you're basically, Enron was this kind of company. And the other companies I was working with were smaller versions of Enron. So most of my working career was spent around people who, they're not as crazy as QAnon or something like that.
Or as the media portrays, people have the right to be. Because I think that people believe that the average Trump voter is crazy. I wouldn't know, but ultimately, I don't think all of them are crazy.
Right. But I think that's why it took me so long to come to the realizations, is because all my peers believed totally in capitalism and totally in free markets and had very conservative economic views.
There is a danger to this idea of the conservatives that I initially didn't acknowledge, because it's not a reality in Europe. But I mean, you grew up in a state, for example, also Texas as an entire state. It's like one of those states that, in my opinion, somewhat has the right to say, hey, I want my guns for self-protection, because some stations are like an hour and a half away and you have this house and it's big and you're like, oh, I need to protect my which is like, yeah, whatever. But you need to protect your family and from thieves and whatever. But I don't know, because then the conservatives are like, oh, but it's the Second Amendment, it's the right of every American to own a gun. No. Like, in my opinion, no, you shouldn't, because if I'm allowed to own a gun, then anybody's allowed to own a gun, and then everybody is a potential murderer.
The Second Amendment actually says that states that the people have the right to own a gun and participate in a well-regulated militia. And there's multiple ways to interpret it. Like many of the amendments, it's very short, so you can actually interpret it different ways. And there are interpretations of it that say, no, there's some people who don't have the right to own a gun. If you've been convicted of, hitting your spousal partner, maybe you shouldn't have a gun.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah.
If you've had problems with suicide in the past, maybe you shouldn't. Maybe you can go down to the shooting range and rent a gun from a locker and still have, shooting in your hobby, right? But maybe you shouldn't be allowed to have one in your house.
I mean, it's strange because I grew up in Italy, and the idea of guns is like, you're either a real criminal or you're a police officer. So it's like you're either the good or the bad, what they teach you, right? That's the thing. When I visited the US, and I saw that people especially in the central states, there are some carry laws that you can carry it, and
Mhm.
like, you can walk in a bar and have the gun showing.
Mhm.
To me, that was such a far concept. I
Yeah,
couldn't understand
for
it
sure.
because I thought about it. I was like, what if this guy just drops his gun by accident?
Mhm.
It fires and kills, I don't know, a pregnant woman. Then it's like, oh, but I have the right to carry my gun. Yeah, but what about that woman? You know, it's like it's a preposterous example, but still, like, it can occur, and that's what scares me the most.
And it should. And growing up in Oklahoma, I had my first 22 rifle given to me when I was 12.
Oh.
I didn't really. I think I took it out once to shoot at buckets. We were going to shoot. Oh no! I think I used it twice growing up. I was not really that much into guns. It was sort of a tradition. My grandfather had given it to me when I turned 12, and the idea was I'd go out and shoot doves or something like that. I remember going to high school, and there would be kids that would have their shotguns
Oh my God.
in their pickup trucks parked out in the high school parking lot. It was not uncommon. Now, it was never supposed to be loaded. The shells would be in a box under the seat or something like that, right? You're not allowed to have a gun in the pickup loaded. But that just was normal for me. And that was Oklahoma. Texas is even crazier.
Yeah, that's the thing. I've been hearing crazy stories.
But is it something to almost worry about? Because say like we're gonna go out, we're gonna go for a night out here in Holland, and we're gonna go to the bar and we get into a bit of a scrap, Then say if we're in the US, what the same situation occurs, could there be a possibility that someone's defense mechanism would be pulling out a gun, and then you have a night out, you get into a scrap, and then all of a sudden the gun's involved?
I think it's getting more and more dangerous as there gets to be more and more people, more population density. I will say that, all the friends I knew in high school who grew up with hunters or guns, they all took gun safety very seriously. This was a rite of passage. This wasn't, they didn't just give you the gun and say, go play outside. Yeah. My parents took me on multiple outings to make sure I knew that, how to hold the gun, only load it under these conditions. This is how you unload it, never look down the barrel of the gun.
Yeah, that's important.
And never ever point it at another person unless you honestly intend to shoot
Seriously
them.
harm them.
Right,
Yeah.
exactly. So don't ever. And these are all good rules, and these all are the kinds of rules that you would learn, I think, if you went to the military. They teach you how to use guns. I never saw irresponsible gun use myself growing up, but it's numbers, right?
Yeah,
The more people you have in a region, some people are going to have emotional problems. Some people are going to have cognitive issues. Some people may have substance abuse issues, so that most of the time they're fine, but then they get into a stretch where they're not thinking clearly. So as a society rule, I mean, there's differences between what you can think of it from an individual perspective, but you also need to think of it from the perspective of the whole society. Switzerland, I think it's Switzerland. Don't they? A lot of people there also own guns, but they have to keep them in lockers or something, right?
I think Sweden was one of the countries that had the highest rates of guns. There's one gun so if there's 4 people in a room, one will have a gun. Now, the reason for that is because the vast majority of people own a gun for hunting.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the biggest reasons is hunting. The other reason is for self-protection, but it was also in terms of animals, not in terms of humans. So you weren't allowed to shoot a human being no matter what.
Right.
But you were allowed to shoot, I don't know, a huge moose or whatever they have in Sweden.
It has nearly 300,000 hunters. But it has
a country like Sweden?
the lowest gun violence.
Yes,
almost the
yes.
lowest gun violence.
And that was this meme that was like, how do you hurt the US? You show them the stats for Sweden. It's because they have an insane amount of guns, but they have a very, 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 if not the lowest rate of murders. So I do believe in that you can educate people to behave a specific way.
Coming back to looking at the U.S. politics from the lens of corporate interests and consumers or working class, sort of a class distinction, gun violence helps gun sales in America. You would think it would be the other way around, but people read a story about gun violence or crime, and they want to go out and buy more guns. Mm-hmm. So there are certain groups out there that don't want to see certain economic interests that are not interested in seeing gun violence decrease. And they have a lot of power because they they hire lobbyists, and they use the Second Amendment as an excuse, as their argument. But really, they're thinking these school shootings are great for my bottom line. I don't know if they're consciously thinking that, but I think the system is rigged in such a way that people who reason their way around that are going to be promoted to lead the gun companies.
I mean, as of now, like, the craziest thing is that, I mean, there are gun producers and, as you said, gun companies that essentially finance even political campaigns, or they finance it in a shady way. But it's like, I used to get, well, I got taught this ages ago, that was, if the people who produce guns finance the political campaign, you will have many wars from then on.
Right.
And that's what scared me, because realizing, I was like, nothing is produced not to be used.
The more I learn about America's real history, and the more I learn about our role in weapons manufacture, the more frustrated and ashamed I am of the government. I think the U.S. does a lot of rhetoric about unstable countries, or countries that are contributing to the instability of the Middle East, or the instability. But just look at the weapons we're selling all over the world. We're the country, I think, more than any other, that is contributing to instability in various regions in the world. We don't do it. It's all done behind the scenes, with weapons deals that you never really hear about, so nobody really pays attention. And I understand that it's not just the U.S. I understand that I think France has a weapons manufacturing industry that's fairly strong.
Italy as well, funnily enough. The Berettas, the guns, the police guns, those were like the first ones. And even Dutch police officers will have those. And Italy is one of those countries very against guns and all. So it's quite funny to... I mean, yeah, what you're saying is extremely correct. But as a European, I can say that I always tend to believe that it's like, you know, what I see on media is exactly a representation of everyday life in the US. And to me, like, the more I talk to Americans, the more I realize that it's not true. It is, to a certain extent.
You have to remember that the vast swaths of America are still very sparsely populated. Most of the Americans you meet, especially if they're traveling abroad, are going to come from the large cities, right? And they can grow up their whole life and never see a gun. And the people that are living in these rural areas in Enid, Oklahoma, they can go their whole life without ever leaving the state, let alone leave the country.
But I think there's a lot of, like, I mean, that's the thing. America did a great campaign to establish this feeling of nationalism. So it's like, you are American. You are, you know, it's like almost a privilege if you see it in movies to be an American. It's like you pledge to the flag right at the age of 5. I think that's a thing. At the age of 5, you pledge to the flag, and it's like you are part of this group that is notorious for being the most powerful country in the world. So it's like, you know, it's almost glorifying. So then I think it's really hard for people who have that belief to see it and be like, no, actually, America is not, maybe, I mean, if they produce this many guns, maybe they're not expatriating peace as much as they taught you.
Right. This also, we want to take a look at this also through that lens of the rich versus the not rich. I'm reading a book right now that's relatively new that talks about this very issue. And the author, I'll have to, it's on my phone. I've been reading it on Kindle on my phone, so I'll have to get the author.
Oh, we will put it on the edit.
But he calls this the noble lie. He traces it back, this idea, to Socrates, where Socrates was saying that in a democracy, you might need, Socrates was worried that you'd have all these different groups that would just vote for their self-interests, but sometimes you have to get the whole community to vote, to agree on something, like during time of war or time of stress or something, or if there's a big community project that needs to be undertaken. So Socrates says, sometimes we need the noble lie, and it's not true, but it's something that the entire voter, electorate can get behind to do something that truly needs to be done. And so he thought of it as a necessary evil. Politicians, ever since Andrew Jackson, in the early 1800s, had learned that lesson, and they came up with this. The noble lie unfortunately, for America, and this is what the argument the author is making, and I think there's a lot of truth to it, having grown up in the U.S. and in Oklahoma, was always built around racism. Because America was a slave country, they needed some sort of lie they could tell themselves to make that okay. And because they wanted the land that the Indians were already living on, they needed some sort of lie to make that okay. And this became truly weaponized in the time of Andrew Jackson, began to be weaponized then. And he used it for a genocide of the Native Americans as he expanded west. And that noble lie let Americans tell that story as if it were these noble frontiers people going out to conquer the wilderness.
Yeah. Funnily enough, I read recently that the people who went and began this campaign were from Leiden. So it were people who, the city Leiden.
Oh,
yeah, they actually left the shores of Europe from there.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, I came to know recently, and I thought it was funny because they actually said, this place is so inhabitable, we must leave. So they went and crossed one of the biggest oceans to go to a land that was... And like, I thought about it, I went to Leiden, it's a dope city, like, I really like it now. So I mean, it was really fun to learn that fact, especially because I would have never guessed how times change.
But to your original question, that's where the idea certainly started, but it has been used over and over again, this American exceptionalism, nationalism type thing. It was used in the 1950s with McCarthyism and the Cold War. Politicians it was used during the Iraq War. Politicians will trot this out anytime they want to manipulate that percentage of the electorate to vote a certain way. And if you look, the way they want that electorate to vote is almost always in a way that will benefit some corporation or some group of corporations, American corporations. So, yes, you're right. There is an exceptionalism. There is this myth that Americans are taught. Even now, we're seeing it again. Trump was very big into it. Trump loved talking about this.
I mean,
because the white lie, so the white lie, which is like or the noble lie,
right?
White lie. The noble lie is like kind of an excuse to do something, but like who was it for? Like who were they lying for? The big corporations, or the population?
So Socrates was trying to say that maybe it's necessary sometimes to lie to the voters in a democracy, and that's a debate we can have. It was a thought experiment for him, but we see it in practical use being used by the owners of capital, the people who already have money, the people who already have power. They're the ones who can make use of that because they own the media. Almost all the media in the U.S. is owned by, I think, 6 different corporations.
Yeah, we studied that recently, actually. It was quite crazy to learn that, especially because when you realize that the media industry in the U.S. has 70% of influence of the global media.
Yeah, that is
production. That's obscene, especially when, for example, Hollywood is the biggest movie producer. Bollywood has a 14% output rate in comparison to the U.S. output.
Yeah.
That's terrifying. But then you realize, I mean, I'd rather have them have the lead. That I don't know. I'd rather see it the way it is now than.
So the distribution of fake news through the media is very relevant today, or is
it's not just so. CNN is not what I would call fake news, but the person who owns the corporation that owns CNN, right? They will hire people to work there that aren't interested in stories that would undermine the existing political structure, the existing power struggle, because they're succeeding in that power struggle. There's no, I don't want to, it's not a conspiracy. It's not people getting together in rooms and saying, now for Fox, yes, it might be, but for CNN.
I mean, we don't know. We don't know.
But for CNN, it's just, I'm a big wealthy business person. I'm going to hire people who agree with the way I think. They're going to hire people that agree with the way they think. And when we get 2 stories in front of us, one about Bernie Sanders and one about Joe Biden, the person making the decision is going to go, because of the way he thinks, he's going to say, well, Joe Biden is a real politician. Bernie Sanders is just some crazy guy. Those ideas don't make any sense at all to me. So they're going to cover the Joe Biden story. So it's not fake news, but it's very corporate biased. There is no Village Voice out there anymore. Village Voice, was a newspaper in New York that was funded locally
Wow, I didn't know it was funded locally.
It's gone out of business, but it was very left leaning because it was funded by subscription locally. It wasn't corporate owned.
Is this also a major contribution to the way people are thinking in the U.S. themselves? Or do they also like, does the average U.S. citizen, would they watch multiple news medias or would they just focus on one, for example, you know?
From what you have observed, at least.
So I don't watch shows like Alex Jones or Tucker Carlson. No, there are people on the left who will because they want to keep up with what's going on.
Yeah.
I don't have enough time in my day to waste it watching a Fox News show or something like that. I'd rather watch. I'll watch a left-leaning show that gives me a 5-minute clip about this is what Tucker's going on about, right? My brother lives in Florida.
Mm-hmm.
Now he grew up in Oklahoma. He joined the Navy. He is a completely nice guy. He would probably classify himself as a centrist, right? Very much into guns. He owns multiple rifles and stuff.
I'd rather have him have it as a Navy.
Right.
Yeah, right.
Part of it is that. Part of it, he was trained to use it, and when he left the Navy, he just doesn't want to let that training go to waste. Part of it, though, is he is a little bit anxious that somebody's going to come take his guns away from me, and so he wants to make sure he can buy them now before they become illegal or something like that. But he has expressed to me once that he does watch Alex Jones because it's kind of entertaining. He knows most of that stuff is silly, that Alex is a little crazy, but it's fun to watch. In America, if you ever ask somebody where they get their news, maybe this has changed, but when I was there last, I've been away for a couple of years, and they say, I get my news from a wide variety, all different news sources. Yeah. That almost always means Fox, Facebook, OANN, Newsmax, and then occasionally they'll read an article in the Wall Street Journal or something like that.
that one is quite. But there's one thing. It's like, I don't know. I've been trying to get the broader picture of how it actually looks as the whole picture, because I don't know. I guess I am to American standards. I would be a leftist, but then it's like I try to listen to people like Ben Shapiro, for example, right? Mm-hmm. Who tries to make a sound argument, right, and tries to make it sound like it's a normal thing. So I'm trying to put it in perspective, and then it never really falls into place. It never really seems like I have the whole thing in front of me, because it's like on one side they're talking about the same exact thing, but they're expressing it in such polarized manners that I don't even know what we're talking about anymore. Because one guy's talking about, hey, I want my guns. And the other guy's talking about, hey, 25 children were shot up yesterday in a school.
Right.
And then you're like, what? It's like, wait, how did right? And then Ben Shapiro about religion, and then they're like, wait, what does religion have to do with guns? And this whole thing, and it's like, as a European, it makes no sense. So therefore, I'm asking, I mean, how would we regulate news? Because I saw a few corporations like Instagram, for example, trying to implement this fact-checking service, mm-hmm. where an algorithm compares your post to a lot of other statistics and tries to say whether it's to 95-degree certainty. Yeah. It can tell you whether this is a fact or not. Mm-hmm. They took that away immediately because an algorithm is not perfect and it can't tell you. But would you say that there should...
There's a TED Talk on that, by the way.
Oh, yeah? Very interesting, yes.
I think it was called "There Is No Algorithm for Truth."
Yeah, I don't think so, because, yeah, it's really interesting. But, I mean, this ties perfectly because also corporations like Twitter have been trying to put boundaries or regulations onto the users. But since there's 330 million users, you can't do it person per person. So you try to make an algorithm. But people are smarter than algorithms, so you'll find hate speech in different ways. People construct hate speech as a community.
Right.
So it's like, how do you stop it with an algorithm? You can't. So do you personally believe that there should be regulations on things like social media, which originally were free to use?
That is a very complex question, and especially complex in the United States, where you have the First Amendment. That was specifically designed. The whole idea of the country is that anybody has a right to. The government cannot impede on the people's rights to discuss ideas. But I think there is one step that has to be looked at very closely and perhaps curtailed, and this is this optimizing recommendations in order to maximize engagement. So if I go on Facebook or Twitter, and Twitter is putting into my feed the posts that they think will keep me on Facebook or Twitter the longest, there's no way around it. You're going to be putting the most radical ends of both spectrums in my feed, which means all I have to do is I use Twitter 3 times a day or Facebook once a day. Maybe all I have to do is once over the course of a week, click on one of those links, and all of a sudden I'm starting down the rabbit hole. And now and the reason they do that is because it's the radical ideas that you're going to click on. Nobody wants to read. Nobody's going to click on a link that says COVID vaccine might be coming out in a month, but we aren't really sure because it's a really complicated issue. Yeah. They're going to click on the link that says Bill Gates is putting microchips inside your COVID vaccine. Mm-hmm. It's ridiculous, but it gets the clicks. I think one thing that can be done without compromising free speech is making it illegal to optimize platform engagement. Algorithms should not be able to optimize. They can optimize, truth, or they can do recommendations based on interests, but they aren't allowed to optimize based on platform engagement. That cannot be the goal.
I see a problem with that in the sense that, the way you frame a piece of news essentially dictates the news.
Yeah.
So the medium is the message there. So if you think about it that way, then you end up thinking that, you can manipulate any sort of information to look in a specific way. Mm-hmm. So what you're saying is essentially to try and, minimize the degree of freedom that these people have to misinform.
Sorry, I just have you ever heard of a show called Yes Minister?
No, actually.
It's a classic BBC show. I highly recommend it. It is as relevant today as it was when it came out. But there's an entire episode about what you just talked about, where you can take, it was in regards to polling. The media can make anything look like any 2 different sides. And the minister, it's a fictional minister. He's talking to his civil service secretary. Mm-hmm. And the civil service secretary goes, well, we can, of course, make the public think pro or con on this issue of this new power plant. Which do you want? He goes, well, how would you do it if I wanted them to be for the power plant? And he goes, well, this is the way the poll would look. And he asks the minister each question in line. And he gets down to that final question, and it's like the minister, are you for the power plant? And the minister says, yes. Oh. And then he goes through the exact same exercise. And when you get to the final question, the answer is obviously no. Mm. And so I highly recommend. I just wanted to agree, and if anybody out there can, most of these BBC minister clips are on YouTube now, and it illustrates it very well. Mm-hmm. But you're right; the media can totally manipulate you into feeling one way or another about an issue.
There was this example that I really love telling people. It's like, if you could take a video of firemen saving children from a burning house, you put it backwards, it looks horrible. It looks horrible. It looks like firemen are throwing children inside a burning house, and you're like, "Oh my god, what is going on?" But then it's like, "No, that's
and
not."
Also, now with these deep fakes,
there's this new thing with deep fakes that, for the audience, in case they don't know, is essentially create, like, you choose a celebrity,
something like that,
a famous person.
You can do it with anyone, though, which is,
and you can become them,
and it looks
so temporarily, realistic. And it's almost, I don't know. It's like, do you actually think we're gonna get to the level of, I guess, through technological advancement or advances, we get to the point where people can mimic other celebrities almost to a T, almost perfectly?
There's I think it's called Quarter or VFX Quarter on YouTube.
Yeah, I think I've heard of them, yeah.
They do special videos on special effects.
Yeah.
And they're a little cheesy. I mean, they're a company, they're doing this to support their brand, but they actually did recently they did a video where in Disney Plus in The Mandalorian, Luke Skywalker, sorry, spoilers.
No, I don't.
Luke Skywalker shows up in the big finale for this season of The Mandalorian. And of course it was a young Luke Skywalker, so they had to do it with CG. Mm-hmm. These guys over at VFX Quarter, or Quarter VFX, they have a 15-minute, 20-minute video where they basically did the same thing using artificial intelligence filters.
And it looks very realistic.
They arguably better than what Disney was able to do, and they only took less than a week to put it together.
But that's the thing. It's like, how do we regulate things that are developing so quickly? Because I mean, from a police point of view, if you can mimic the identity of someone else, that's called identity theft.
Yeah.
So if you can create an ID that looks perfect to the ID of someone else with all the details, and you have a mask that is perfectly identical to the person,
I don't think it'll ever get to where it's perfect. But the problem is that when you take video, like if you had access to the raw video, I think we'll always be able to differentiate the deep fakes from the real. But when you compress it down to YouTube, you lose a lot of that information. I don't know. It doesn't have to be perfect, right? It just has to be good enough to make it through the compression.
If it's on social media, I feel like the people would believe it. If you just see it, imagine like seeing a video of yourself. It could almost be incriminating because like the person creating it can do whatever he wants with like the information, so they can like make you look bad to the public, even though you haven't done anything. They just have that deep fake of you. That's kind of a scary thought.
I mean, ultimately, I think the problem is that technology is replacing the human interactions that we used to have on a daily basis. So, as you said, ancient Greece, the way that democracy functioned perfectly was a bunch of people meeting on a hill and talking about politics.
Right.
The problem is that that hill now became a digital hill where people can express their ideas, and the guy who gets to stand on top of the hill is the guy who screams the loudest, so the guy with the most followers.
Right. And this brings us back to the algorithm, though, right? Because who decides the loudest voice? Is the person who gets them? Is it the person who gets the most likes or retweets, and how do they get that if it's not for things like recommendations and algorithms and such? It's a feedback loop. The loudest voice isn't the person who's most people agree with. It's the person that most people click on or feel the need to retweet, which isn't necessarily the same thing.
I mean, the problem with YouTube, for example, I think you can find it even as an example, our own first season. Like the titles that had the most eye-catching titles were the ones that automatically outperformed some of the higher quality podcasts. Which is funny to me because it's like in one podcast, okay, like, superficial talk, very interesting nonetheless, but less technical than other podcasts. But those technical podcasts are outdoing the general ones because, I don't know, catchy title or something funny in the thumbnail, something crazy like that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't show YouTube that these people enjoyed my video, right? But it means that they consumed the video, and that's what YouTube really cares about. Ultimately, they really care about the efficiency of their products, and their products is what the user uploads. So if the user uploads a video that gets watched 1,000 times, to them it's safe to assume that yes, more of that video will be good.
Right, exactly.
It's a scary thought, but it's one that we must acknowledge, I suppose, especially in terms of this technological advances. But this advancement. But to go back on politics, do you think there will ever be a way for people to vote, just as they did this year with the letter? They did the mail voting, which was a great opportunity for Trump to say it was rigged or whatever, right? Because one of his starting grounds was that, but this is also a way that they're going to manipulate the votes. Yeah. This is also a way that they're going to do that. But I guess, do you think we're going to get to the point where we can vote through technology?
I like to think so. I do. There's a lot of fascinating stuff going on with the mathematics behind cryptography, and of course, secure, verifiable voting is a big mathematical problem, and I think they've made some progress on it. I'm not an expert in it, but I think that there is the possibility. I'm not one of those people that says no, electronic voting could never possibly happen. I think using something like a blockchain cryptographic type of technology, you could come up with a way to securely allow for voting and still let the person verify that their vote was counted like they meant it to be counted. But we're not there yet. And I think vote by mail, I think, is fairly secure. There really hasn't been any evidence of voter fraud. And there have been states doing it in the U.S. long before Trump came along. Washington State, I lived in Portland, Oregon, but it's on the border with Washington State. And for a period there, I lived up in Vancouver, Washington. Not the same as Vancouver, Canada. Same name, different Vancouver. And Washington State had vote by mail. And that was really makes voting so much easier for an American. There's no holiday on election day in America. You have to take off work if you want to vote. So I think vote by mail is something that, and voting early so that you don't have to wait until election day to put your vote in. I think these are all good things. I think all of these will happen. The only reason that Trump has an issue with them and they're what's the word? Not
reliability.
Controversial.
Okay.
The only reason they're controversial is the Republicans know that the more people who vote, the less they win. Their whole strategy is built on voter suppression.
That's also why I'm also really happy about what we saw these years or these last years about a lot of people pushing each other to go vote. So
Yeah.
Instagram is putting all these filters. It's like, go vote now, take your time, do it for your country, do it, as it does play a role in the big scheme of things, right? And that's the thing.
Let's talk about that for a second, because that's really exciting. I see this in the US, and I think it's happening. It may have been happening in Europe for even longer. But I have been really, of course, not everybody, but there has been the younger generation, say people who are college age and younger. I've seen a bunch of them really step up. I've seen so much more political involvement, at least in the U.S., from the younger generation than has been seen since the 1970s. And they seem to understand the issues really well. There was the survivors of the Parkland school shooting in Florida, and they didn't just disappear. They made a stink. And thank goodness they did. I see more and more younger people running for local office. I'm very excited about the future. So long as we don't, I'm a little concerned that they might burn out. This is what happened in the 70s. You had there was a bunch of young people interested in politics. They didn't understand how hard it is and what a long struggle it was. They thought maybe they could just do a couple of protests and make a change.
Yeah. I feel like social media also plays a major role in this, like, because the younger population is exposed to the social media, well, more than I think the average person. And it also helps raise awareness, so they're able to connect with all these people around the US.
And they have access to non-corporate media.
Yeah.
And that brings us back to, shows like TYT is very big in the US. And TYT, I don't always agree with everything TYT says. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they're not corporate.
No.
And so I think that's exciting. The Sunrise Movement. Greta Thunberg, thank you. She gets so much more coverage on the non-corporate media than she does in the corporate media. And the young people through social media can see her posts and can see other groups that are talking about her.
It's crazy because this social media loop, it's like you have the established media trying to undermine the new up-and-coming media, right? So it's like you have some producers, some movie stars who are trying to push an agenda that is, I don't know, more liberal than they would like to endorse, and they just don't use those actors, although they're very highly requested. That's like that same thing goes on media as well, where you have some YouTube channels who are taking political stances just for what they call clout or attention. So, for example, Joe Rogan, great podcast host, one of the greatest to do podcasts ever. As soon as he started taking a right-leaning stance, a lot of people started to critique him because it's like, okay, you talk, that's your job. You talk to a lot of people, that's cool. But don't start indoctrinating people into believing a specific thing. And that's what people should be really careful about. It's like when you have a big platform, automatically you should assume that you're not influencing all of them, but there is a percent out there that you are influencing, whether it is because they're having a bad day or because they look up to you as a hero or because they've never thought about it that way and the way you said it makes it sound better than it actually is. I think you should, especially with social media, you should be very careful about what you personally try to get people to think about.
So Cedric, Davida, I've got a question for both of you. Do you feel that your education is teaching you the skills you need so that you can go out onto the internet or into the world and you can differentiate between opinions that are not based in fact and like the true consensus of experts or knowledge that is actually factual. Because it's not an easy skill set, I don't think.
I feel like it's very difficult actually to differentiate, especially if you don't have prior knowledge about, who the actual people are who are spreading the information. Like if you don't have that background knowledge of corporations, for example, it'd be very difficult to tell whether what they're saying is the truth or not. So that's why sometimes for me, in my past and in my experience, usually the way I learn is, I read the articles for sure, and then I talk to people. I get all their different opinions, and that is how I kind of structure my own idea around it all. But to differentiate the fake and the not, it is very difficult to see that, because at the end of the day, the content that's put out there, it all seems very professional. It's almost aimed to make the audience believe that. So it would be, it's very difficult. But talking to people, getting everyone's opinions, that's what really helps, and then from there you can kind of create your own idea.
In terms of education, we received almost exactly the same sort of education. But in terms of it, the International Baccalaureate is always trying to make people understand the sources. So they really put emphasis on finding the source, assessing the source, especially if you're doing history or physics, for example. You have to give what your study is, how you got it, who says it, what source backs it up, and all that. I don't think that taught me how to differentiate real from fake. I think small things like what my father taught me. He just said in simple words, he said, don't listen to what the media say, listen to what the state report of whatever you're studying says, which is a very police mentality, right? He is.
Right.
But that's the thing. He was just like, if there's organizations that are put in place to make a report about, I don't know, the waste of a country in this year, listen to them rather than the media. That's what he always taught me. Now, am I doing that? I don't know. I don't think so. But I don't believe media on the premise of simply the fact that they're media. Because I think they're flawed.
Yeah.
If everyone has a voice, then everyone's allowed to speak, then everyone's a professional.
That's true.
I'm a professional too, then.
Yeah, but say with like the different type of news media you'd expose yourself to. Yeah, like what my dad told me when watching the news, like this is why I asked you the question, is actually see the different perspectives. So for example, like Al Jazeera is a news anchor in
No, you can.
It's just it's another news anchor, so it kind of gives a different perspective on, for example, the problems in the US. So if you can expose yourself to the different news anchors from different countries who all have different views, then you're able to see, you can balance and kind of pick out the things that would, that you believe, or what. Then again,
I'm right there with you. I try to use some of the same rules. The only thing I might add is one thing I really do like about Twitter and social media, YouTube, is that if it comes down to a technical question, is the vaccine safe? Climate change, what's the steps? You can use those platforms not to look up just anybody, but look up 3 or 4 different climate scientists. Not just they're out there. They're trying to get their message out. YouTube, like MIT and a lot of these universities have open courseware online, and there might be something out there about it. Because you really want to find out directly from the experts. Because somehow the news stories, they'll go interview the experts, and then they don't always translate it correctly.
Yeah, they kind of regurgitate what they said, but in a misshaped way. Like I remember there was this, one of the people who studied the vaccine early on, one of the people who stood up and said, their opinion. He was simply expressing the idea that yes, this has happened before, like through centuries, this has occurred, this is likely to take on, and it is likely to kill a lot of people. And I remember the article was, what was it, Virolog, which is virologist. I think that's the a scientist who studies viruses, just said his name and then said, claims virus will kill many.
Right.
It's like, that strikes me like, whoa, we're all going to die. It's like, and then you're like, no, that's not what he said.
There's a physicist out there, Sabine Hofstadter, but she's relatively new on YouTube. She's a real physicist, and she has been going around saying, and you guys stop me if I go on for too long.
No, don't you worry.
Okay. But she's been going around saying, we should not invest any more money in any more super colliders. We should take that money and spend it on something else, which is, okay, that's a valid point. But I have friends, and she's the only physicist I know, particle physicist I know, who is really making that claim.
I mean, yeah.
It's worth talking about. It's a subject, right? But I don't see, Sean Carroll or Brian Greene or the PBS space-time guy making this claim. They all would kind of like a larger super collider at some point to do some more experiments. And yet I have friends who will go out and find that one physicist, Sabine, and they'll come in and they'll say, "Oh, the entire field of physics is going down the wrong road." You have to find the physicists and the researchers, the virologists, but then you have to find 2 or 3 others and try to get a feel for what's the consensus among the experts. Yeah. It's consensus among the experts is different than majority of the mob, right? These are people that are having conversations all the time, that have studied it their whole lives, and if 90% of them believe something is true,
probably true,
it's you're better off going with that.
Because we forget that people have their own reputation to uphold. So if you're a professor, right, and you're trying to teach history and then you get a fact wrong in a class, those students are going to think that you're not as educated as your PhD says. You have a reputation to uphold. If you're a news anchor and you report the wrong news or you get the wrong host on, your reputation will be on the line. And I think the same should be for scientists, and that's how we should assess the reality we live in. But do not drag this out too long. I don't want to waste too much of your time. But
I've enjoyed it. It's been a lot of fun.
Thank you. It means a lot. And thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Firstly. Thank you, Cedric, for also joining us.
Yeah, thank you for coming in.
Thank you, Paul.
I hope we get to do this again sometime, because we never got to talk about artificial intelligence.
No, but we will. We will. Don't you worry. Take care, guys. I'll see you guys later.